They called themselves the living blade. Not metaphorically, literally. A samurai wasn't a man who owned a sword. He was a sword. His body, his breath, his honor, his children, his death. All of it existed only to cut. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Being a weapon is glorious right up until the moment you realize weapons don't retire. They break. They rust. Or if they're lucky, they're allowed to shatter beautifully in one final, purposeful swing. Most samurai didn't get that luxury. Most just waited. Decades of waiting. Praying for a war that might never come. Because without war, a sword is just expensive decoration. And a samurai without a battle is just a man slowly starving in armor he can't afford to take off. This is a story about what happens when an entire culture builds itself around warriors, but then runs out of wars. When the myth becomes more powerful than the man. And when dying with honor becomes easier than living with shame. We idolize the samurai because it represents something we think we've lost: discipline, loyalty, purpose. But we forgot to ask them if they actually wanted to be what we turned them into. Most of them didn't. They were trapped inside a beautiful lie. And that lie had a body count. There's this image we carry. The samurai standing on a hilltop at dawn, katana gleaming, wind in his hair, ready to die for his lord. It's romantic. It's powerful. It's everywhere: movies, games, posters. But here's what that image doesn't show you. That same samurai goes home to a house with no food. His wife is weaving to keep them alive. His children haven't seen him smile in years. He spends his evenings polishing a sword he hasn't drawn in a decade, trying to convince himself his life has meaning. The myth was built on sacrifice. And sacrifice sounds noble until you realize it's just another word for suffering in silence. For 200 years, the samurai were the face of Japan. They were the law, the enforcers, the edge of the emperor's will. They fought in brutal civil wars, died in massive numbers, and became legends. Their code, Bushido, was supposed to make them superhuman. Courage, loyalty, honor above life. It worked. They became the most feared warriors in Asia. But then something unexpected happened. Peace. The Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan in 1603. And suddenly, the samurai had no one left to fight. No wars. No enemies. Just life. And life is a terrible battlefield for a weapon. They were still samurai. They still carried their swords. They still wore their status like armor. But now their job was bureaucracy, paperwork, ceremony. They were administrators cosplaying as warriors. And they were broke. See, samurai were paid in rice, fixed stipends from their lord. But rice prices fluctuated. Inflation happened. Meanwhile, merchants, people samurai, were supposed to look down on, were getting rich. A merchant could eat meat, live in a nice house, buy art. A samurai? He could barely afford to keep his sword sharpened. But he couldn't complain, couldn't take a side job, couldn't lower himself to commerce. That would be dishonorable. So he just endured, in silence, while his kids went hungry. That's the paradox. The people with the most status had the least freedom. They were prisoners of their own identity. And it gets darker. Because when you build your entire sense of self around being ready to die, what do you do when nobody's asking you to? You start to rot from the inside. Depression was rampant. Alcoholism. Domestic violence. Some samurai would pick fights just to feel alive again. Others would sit in their homes, staring at their swords, wondering if they'd wasted their entire existence preparing for a moment that would never come. There's this term running: masterless samurai. Men whose lords had died or dismissed them. Society treated them like ghosts. They wandered, took odd jobs, became bodyguards, mercenaries, sometimes criminals. The shame of it crushed most of them, because in their world, a samurai without a master wasn't a free man. He was a broken tool, useless. And in Bushido, uselessness was worse than death. So they died a lot. Seppuku, ritual suicide, wasn't some rare, dramatic thing. It was common, expected even. Failed your lord? Seppuku. Disgraced your family? Seppuku. Lost a battle? Seppuku. Couldn't afford to feed your children and felt like a failure? Some chose seppuku. It was considered the honorable way out. You'd slice open your own belly slowly, painfully. while a trusted friend stood behind you ready to behead you once the suffering became too much. This was mercy. This was dignity. And the culture celebrated it, wrote poems about it, held it up as the ultimate proof of character. But let's be clear, it was also a way to get rid of problems, a way to avoid the messy reality of supporting people who'd outlived their usefulness. You can call it honor if you want, but it's also just state-sponsored despair with a fancy name. Here's the cruelest part. The rest of Japan loved them. Peasants looked up to them. Artists immortalized them. Everyone wanted to be like them, but almost no one actually understood what their lives felt like. The samurai became a symbol, and symbols don't get to be human. They don't get to admit they're tired, scared, or broken. They just have to keep performing, keep pretending the weight of that sword isn't crushing their spine. The image mattered more than the man, and Japan needed that image. It needed to believe in something pure, something disciplined, something untouchable. So it turned the samurai into myth, and myths don't complain. They just fade quietly when no one's looking. By the time the Meiji Restoration came in 1868, the samurai class was abolished. Swords were banned. The men who had defined Japan for centuries were suddenly obsolete. Some adapted, became businessmen, soldiers in the new army, politicians. But many couldn't. They'd spent their entire lives being told they were special, chosen, superior. And now they were just people. And people have to survive. People have to compromise. People have to admit they don't have all the answers. That's not something Bushido prepared them for. So a lot of them just gave up. Some literally, some spiritually. They became ghosts in their own country, wandering through a world that no longer had space for what they were. And here's the thing we don't want to admit. We're still doing it. We still take people and turn them into symbols. Soldiers, athletes, entrepreneurs. We put them on pedestals and tell them they're heroes, legends, warriors. We make movies about them. We quote them. We buy their merch. But we don't ask if they're okay. We don't ask if the identity we've forced onto them is slowly killing them. We just consume the myth and move on. The samurai weren't destroyed by war. They were destroyed by peace, by the weight of being perfect, by a culture that loved the idea of them more than it cared for the reality of them. So maybe the lesson isn't about honor. Maybe it's about the cost of being a symbol, about what happens when we worship strength so much we forget that strength is just a human pretending not to break. The samurai gave everything, their lives, their families, their sanity, and we remember them as legends. But they didn't want to be legends. They just wanted to be enough. And the tragedy is they always were, but nobody ever told them that. They just handed them a sword and said, "This is who you are." And by the time they realized they were more than that, it was too late. The blade had already become them, and all that was left was the cut.